The moment you stopped reacting, their nervous system panicked. You didn't chase, didn't explain, didn't demand closure. And that's exactly when the dynamic cracked. Avoidants don't rely on consistency, they rely on predictability. Emotional access on their terms. As long as they know you'll respond, react, or stay emotionally available, their nervous system stays regulated. The moment you removed yourself without drama, you didn't disappear. You became unreachable, not blocked, not angry, just unavailable. And for an avoidant, nothing is more destabilizing than a door that didn't slam but closed quietly. At first, they tell themselves it's relief, space, freedom. They convince themselves they wanted this outcome, but something feels off almost immediately. There's no tension to pull against, no emotion to manage, no reassurance that they still matter without having to show up. Your calm exit removes the familiar pattern they depended on, and without that pattern, their internal balance slips. They don't feel abandoned, they feel unanchored. What unsettles them most is that your silence doesn't carry accusation. You didn't punish them, you didn't collapse, you didn't beg to be chosen. And that absence of chaos forces something: avoidance. Work hard to avoid self-awareness, because when no one is chasing them, they have to sit with their own behavior. There's no distraction, no emotional noise to drown out the truth. They start replaying moments they once minimized, conversations they brushed off, the way you stayed steady while they stayed distant. Not because they suddenly became emotional, but because your detachment removes the buffer that protected them from reflection. Your lack of reaction communicates something powerful without saying a word. I can exist without you. And that realization hits deeper than anger ever could. What really shifts the power isn't your absence, it's your regulation. You didn't leave in pieces. You didn't leave emotionally dysregulated. You left, and for an avoidant, that's deeply disorienting because it breaks the unspoken rule they rely on that closeness destabilizes others more than it destabilizes them. When that rule collapses, they're left questioning their role in the dynamic. They begin to wonder why they feel uneasy when they were the one who needed space. Why control feels lost even though no one is confronting them. Why they feel watched by a silence that asks for nothing. Your quiet withdrawal removes their ability to re-enter on familiar terms. No emotional leverage, no unfinished conversation, no open loop waiting for them to return. And that's when the nervous system panics. Not loudly, not dramatically, but subtly, in restlessness, in checking, in sudden curiosity about where you went emotionally, because you didn't just stop reacting, you stopped orienting your inner world around them. And once that happens, the balance of power doesn't just shift. Silence doesn't scare, avoidance, meaning, does. They expect conflict, they expect emotional pursuit. They expect you to stay engaged even when you're hurt. Because engagement, even painful engagement, keeps the bond alive on terms they understand. Arguments reassure them that they still matter. Tears confirm attachment. Even anger feels safe because it proves you're still emotionally invested. What they don't expect is your absence without bitterness. No accusations, no passive-aggressive distance, no emotional residue left behind for them to manage. Because silence without resentment doesn't register as punishment. It registers as finality. And finality is the one thing avoidants are not prepared for, because it removes their ability to return later and reset the dynamic. When there's no emotional charge in your silence, there's nothing to negotiate with. No apology will land. No explanation will reopen the door. The lack of emotional hooks creates a quiet panic they can't name. That's when the questions start. Not out loud, not to you, but internally. Did I misjudge them? Why aren't they reaching out? What changed? These questions are destabilizing because they don't come from longing, they come from lost orientation. Avoidants regulate themselves by knowing where they stand in someone's emotional world. Your silence removes that reference point completely. What unsettles them most is that your absence doesn't seek validation. You're not waiting to be understood. You're not leaving breadcrumbs. You're not proving your pain. You simply stopped participating. And that forces them into a space where meaning replaces every unanswered expectation, becomes loud. every assumption they made about your availability collapses. You didn't argue your value. You didn't defend your worth. You didn't explain what they lost. You removed the debate entirely. And when there's no debate, there's no way to win, no way to reframe, no way to minimize what happened. Your silence doesn't invite interpretation, it closes the loop. This is why silence hits harder than words. Words can be dismissed, emotions can be invalidated, conflict can be reframed as too much. But silence paired with emotional neutrality sends a different message. I see clearly, and I'm done engaging. That message bypasses their defenses and goes straight to the nervous system. At first, they try to rationalize it. They tell themselves you're playing a game, that you'll resurface, that this is temporary. But time passes and nothing changes. No emotional flare-ups, no late night messages, no signs you're waiting to be chosen. And slowly, the realization sets in that this isn't strategy, it's resolution. Your silence becomes a mirror they can't avoid. It reflects the version of the connection that no longer exists and the version of themselves they never had to face when you were emotionally available. They don't feel attacked. They feel exposed because your absence doesn't accuse them. It leaves them alone with the meaning of their choices. And that's why silence, when it's clean and final, lands deeper than any confrontation ever could. Avoidants don't fear losing you. They fear losing control over when you matter. Before they decide the rhythm of the connection. When to pull close, just enough to keep you engaged. When to disappear without explanation. When to return and re-enter your emotional space as if nothing had happened. That control wasn't always conscious, but it was familiar. It kept them safe. As long as they could manage distance and timing, they never had to fully confront the depth of the bond or the cost of avoiding it. But now, something fundamental has changed. They don't know your emotional location anymore. They don't know if you're open, closed, indifferent, or simply gone. And that lack of access creates a level of uncertainty they're not equipped to regulate. Avoidants are comfortable with distance. When it's chosen, they unravel when distance is imposed without their consent. Because uncertainty removes their ability to predict outcomes, and predictability is how they maintain control without vulnerability. That uncertainty triggers the very thing they avoid. Self-reflection. Without your emotional availability to orient themselves, they're left alone with their internal narrative. They start replaying moments they once skimmed past. The look you gave when they pulled away. The conversation they delayed responding to. The time you stayed calm when they expected you to react. These memories resurface not as emotion, but as questions they can't easily dismiss. They reread conversations, searching for shifts they missed. They rewrite memories, reframing moments where they were distant as necessary, justified, harmless, not to understand you, but to protect their self-image. Because if they acknowledge the full impact of their behavior, control isn't the only thing they lose. They lose the story they've been telling themselves. This isn't sudden emotional growth, it's damage control. They're not replaying the past because they miss you in a romantic sense. They're replaying it because the ending no longer belongs to them. When avoidants control the ending, they can minimize it. They can say it faded, that it wasn't right, that it had to happen. But when the ending happens without their input, quietly, cleanly, without negotiation, it resists reinterpretation. And that's destabilizing. Because now every unanswered question sits unresolved. There's no final conversation to lean on, no emotional reaction to validate their timing, no chance to re-enter and feel significant again. Your detachment removes their ability to regulate their self-worth through your responsiveness. They begin to feel something unfamiliar, emotional irrelevance, not rejection, not abandonment, irrelevance. And for someone who relied on controlling closeness to feel safe, that's deeply unsettling. It forces them to confront the possibility that you didn't need closure because you already had clarity, that you didn't wait for their return because you no longer oriented your emotional world around them. And that's when it hits them. They didn't lose you because they left. They lost you because they no longer control the meaning of the ending. And that loss, quiet, irreversible, and unacknowledged, is what stays with them long after the silence settles. They're not missing you. They're missing the version of themselves that felt safe avoiding. What looks like chaos on the surface isn't longing in the way most people imagine it. It's not romantic yearning or a sudden emotional awakening. It's disorientation. Your detachment removed the emotional mirror they used to regulate themselves. When you were present, even at a distance, you served a function they rarely acknowledged. You anchored them. You absorbed the push-pull. You stayed emotionally legible even when they weren't. And that made avoidance feel safe. You were the anchor they pushed away, but relied on. Now that anchor is gone, not dramatically removed, not ripped away in anger, simply absent, and without it, their internal balance falters. They don't know how to orient themselves emotionally because the person who once adapted to their distance is no longer doing that work for them. Your calm withdrawal exposes how much regulation they outsourced to your presence. Without you, their usual coping strategies start to fail. Distractions don't land the way they used to. Work, hobbies, social noise, none of it fills the space the same way. New connections feel hollow, not because those people are inadequate, but because those connections don't know how to orbit their avoidance yet. There's no familiar rhythm, no unspoken agreement that closeness will always be followed by distance. And emotional numbness, the state they once relied on for control, becomes louder. It stops feeling like peace and starts feeling like emptiness. When there's no one reflecting stability back to them, numbness doesn't feel protective. It feels exposed. The silence you left behind amplifies everything they work to keep muted. This is why they feel crazy, not frantic, not desperate, just internally unsettled, restless in ways they can't articulate. They might check their phone more often, revisit old conversations, wonder why nothing new feels grounding, but they rarely connect it directly to you because that would require admitting how much they depended on the dynamic. And here's the part no one says out loud. They're not unraveling because you left. They're unraveling because you stayed gone without needing them. If you had left loudly, they could frame it as conflict. If you had stayed emotionally tethered, they could rely on the idea of return, but you did neither. You didn't collapse, you didn't circle back, you didn't require reassurance or explanation. That absence of need removes their sense of relevance. They were comfortable being needed from a distance. They were comfortable knowing they could re-enter your emotional world on familiar terms. What they weren't prepared for was your ability to self-regulate without them, to stabilize without their presence, to move forward without carrying emotional residue. Your detachment doesn't attack them, and it destabilizes the structure they built to avoid intimacy without consequence. And when that structure collapses, what remains isn't longing. It's the unsettling realization that the version of themselves who felt safe avoiding only existed because you were still there. And now you aren't. The scariest thing for an avoidant isn't abandonment. It's realizing they weren't chased. For a long time, the dynamic worked because they expected pursuit. Not necessarily desperation, but engagement, questions, emotional availability, the subtle sense that no matter how far they pulled back, you would remain oriented toward them. That expectation allowed them to leave without fully losing you. Distance felt safe because it was reversible, but you broke that pattern. You didn't prove your worth. You didn't explain yourself into being understood. You didn't demand accountability or clarity. You didn't wait for the moment they would finally be ready to show up. Instead, you chose something far more destabilizing, self-containment. You gathered your energy back into yourself and stopped leaking it into a dynamic that required you to shrink. That's when the script flipped, because now they aren't dealing with someone who is hurt and waiting. They're dealing with someone who made a decision internally and didn't need permission to do it. Your absence isn't loud. It doesn't ask to be interpreted. It simply exists. And that leaves them with no role to step back into. They start to realize something unsettling. You didn't disappear to provoke a reaction. You didn't go silent to be chased. You didn't detach to teach them a lesson. You left because staying no longer made sense. And that realization removes the comfort of delayed return. This is the truth. They can't outrun. You didn't lose interest. You didn't stop caring. You didn't suddenly become cold or detached for no reason. You simply outgrew the role they assigned you, the role of emotional availability without emotional reciprocity, the role of understanding without being understood, the role of waiting quietly while they decided when closeness was allowed. Outgrowing that role is what unsettles them most, because it reframes the entire connection. It suggests that love wasn't the problem. Timing wasn't the problem. Circumstances weren't the problem. The problem was the structure itself. And once that structure collapsed, there was nothing left to negotiate. They may never admit this out loud. Avoidants rarely do. But internally, it shows up as restlessness, as the sense that something unresolved follows them forward. They carry the knowledge that someone once chose themselves without needing to be chased, convinced, or rescued. And that knowledge lingers. Because if you didn't need them to leave to find yourself, then your presence was never guaranteed in the first place. And that thought destabilizes the belief that people stay no matter what. Long after you've moved on, long after your nervous system has settled and your life has expanded, they're still sitting with the same realization. Not that they lost you, but that you stopped playing the part they needed you to play. And that is the ending they never learned how to control. The moment they sensed you weren't on pause for them, something broke. Avoidants often leave with an unspoken assumption that time will remain flexible, that while they step back, you'll stay emotionally parked. You might process the distance, feel the loss, even grow a little, but not move on in any way that changes the outcome. In their mind, progress is allowed only if it doesn't alter availability. They assume you'll be there later, calmer, quieter, still reachable. That assumption is part of what makes leaving feel safe. But when they realize you're actually living, when there are no signs of waiting, no subtle signals meant for them, no emotional breadcrumbs left behind, their internal sense of safety collapses. You're not posting to be seen. You're not hinting at pain or resilience. You're not lingering at the edge of the connection. You've stepped fully back into your own life, and that changes everything. Because now the timeline they depended on no longer exists. They can't return to the version of you that was emotionally available, on standby. They can't step back into the dynamic without acknowledging that something irreversible happened while they were gone. That forces them to confront a truth they weren't prepared for. You didn't freeze your life to accommodate their distance. This realization hits quietly but deeply. It shows up as a subtle sense of being left behind, not because you abandoned them, but because you didn't pause your growth for them. The world kept moving, and so did you. And suddenly, their absence had consequences they never accounted for. They feel unsettled because the future they imagined, a future where they could return without cost, no longer exists. You were supposed to be available later, not gone for good, not fully elsewhere, just distant enough to be safe, but close enough to retrieve. When that expectation collapses, it can feel like betrayal, even though you owed them nothing. That's the contradiction they struggle with. There's no rule you broke, no promise you violated, no boundary you crossed. Yet emotionally, it feels as if something was taken from them. Not you, but the reassurance that you would still be there when they decided they were ready. And that loss exposes something avoidants rarely confront: entitlement to emotional availability without commitment. When that entitlement dissolves, what remains is discomfort they can't easily escape. They may minimize it, rationalize it, tell themselves they didn't want the connection anyway. But the internal shift has already happened because now they know. You didn't wait. You didn't linger. You didn't hold the door open quietly. You continued living. And once an avoidant realizes they were not the center of your timeline, they're forced to sit with the consequences of leaving without fully letting go. That awareness follows them forward, not as regret, but as a quiet fracture in the belief that people remain accessible, no matter how long they're kept waiting. And that fracture never fully heals. Avoidants don't chase, they monitor. They won't text. They won't ask how you are. They won't confess what they're feeling or admit confusion. That would require vulnerability. And vulnerability threatens the control they rely on to feel safe. So instead of reaching out, they watch quietly, indirectly, from a distance that feels protected. Stories get viewed, timing gets noted, patterns get tracked. They notice when you post, when you don't, how often and what kind of energy it carries, not because they're trying to reconnect, but because monitoring is safer than engaging. It allows them to stay informed without risking exposure. What they're really looking for isn't you, it's reassurance. Reassurance that they still exist somewhere in your emotional world, that your life hasn't fully moved on, that there's still a trace of them in your behavior, your timing, your tone. As long as they can find that proof, detachment works. They can remain distant while believing the connection still lives in the background. But when they can't find it, something shifts. When your posts stop hinting, when your energy no longer feels reactive or reflective of the past, when your absence becomes consistent instead of strategic, that's when anxiety replaces avoidance. Because avoidance depends on emotional reachability. It requires the other person to remain psychologically available, even when physically absent. Your neutrality disrupts that. They begin to feel unsettled, not because they want closeness, but because they've lost their reference point. Monitoring no longer provides comfort. It raises questions instead. Why does nothing seem aimed at me? Why do they feel further away now than when we weren't speaking? Why does this feel final? This is the paradox of avoidant attachment. They avoid direct contact, yet rely on indirect access to regulate themselves. When even that access disappears, the internal balance collapses. They're forced to confront the possibility that you're no longer emotionally reachable. Not because you're angry, but because you're done. And that's far more destabilizing. They may tell themselves they're just curious, that checking means nothing. But the behavior continues because it serves a purpose. It keeps the connection alive without demanding anything from them, or at least it used to. Now it only highlights how little influence they have over your inner world. This is when the nervous system becomes restless. Avoidance no longer brings relief, it brings tension. They might feel pulled to check again, not for connection, but for certainty. And the absence of certainty becomes the source of discomfort they can't easily escape. Because detachment only works when the other person is still emotionally reachable. When you are responsive, predictable, and open, distance felt safe. Now, your self-containment removes the safety net. Monitoring stops working. Control feels lost. And even though they still won't chase, the watching becomes heavier. Not because they want you back, but because they don't know where they stand anymore. And for an avoidant, that uncertainty is the most destabilizing position of all. They don't break down when you leave. They break down when nothing replaces you. At first, there's a sense of relief, freedom, space, control regained. Avoidants often leave or behave as if they have, believing they've escaped attachment. And in those early days, that belief feels true. They can engage in distractions, work, hobbies, superficial connections. They convince themselves that absence equals liberation, that the emotional weight they avoided has been successfully evaded. But weeks later, something subtle shifts. The distractions begin to fail. The new connections, no matter how engaging at first, lack the depth they unconsciously crave. They find themselves scanning social feeds, replaying past interactions, recalling the moments when you were steady in a way no one else is. The quiet, which at first was tolerable, becomes unavoidable. It creeps in during mundane moments. Mornings without a text, evenings without a sign, weekends without context. That quiet is not empty, it's revealing. That's when the grief arrives, not as the dramatic sadness people expect, not as tears or declarations. It arrives as disorientation, a subtle, gnawing recognition that something is missing and they don't know how to name it. It's not about you directly. Not yet. It's about what you represented. Consistency, clarity, emotional presence that never demanded they show up, but always reflected them. They can't articulate it and often won't even to themselves. There's no single object for their unease, no conversation to reclaim, no closure to demand. It's the absence of replacement that unsettles them. All the people they can engage with now fail to provide the same mirror. The depth that existed when you were around, steady, self-contained, unreactive, is impossible to replicate. The calm, unforced reliability they once relied on now exists only in memory. And that realization is destabilizing because avoidance relies on control, predictability, and the belief that absence is neutral. When absence reveals what cannot be replaced, the illusion collapses. They feel untethered, restless, unmoored from their own emotional framework. The structure they depended on, your presence even at a distance, was supporting their regulation, and now it's gone. This delayed crash is quiet but profound. It doesn't announce itself with melodrama. It manifests in subtle restlessness, in thoughts they can't shake, in attempts to reorient their perspective, even as the truth refuses to conform. They may try to explain it away, rationalize it, or distract themselves further, but the gap remains. Ultimately, the emotional crash happens because avoidance works only when the other person's role remains predictable and emotionally accessible. When you leave and nothing steps into your space, not with drama, not with replacement, not with urgency, they confront the stark truth. They were dependent on your constancy more than they ever realized. And when that realization lands, it is impossible to ignore. The delayed crash is not about loss alone. It's about recognition that what they pushed away cannot be replicated, and that something vital, steady, self-contained, and unattached never came back. And in that truth, they finally feel the weight of what avoidance could never prevent. When they can't reach you, they rewrite you. Avoidants have a peculiar way of protecting themselves from the discomfort of absence. They reconstruct reality. When your presence is no longer accessible, suddenly the memory of you shifts. You were always important. You were always attuned. You were the one who understood them better than anyone else ever could. Not because they changed, not because they suddenly feel differently, but because distance makes truth safer. Loving you now doesn't require vulnerability. It doesn't demand action, confession, or confrontation. Regret doesn't require risk. They romanticize what they once ignored, protectively reconstructing the past to soothe the unease your absence creates. The moments they overlooked are suddenly illuminated, reframed, and given significance that never existed while you were present. And in doing so, they maintain a sense of control over a reality that has, in fact, escaped them. This rewriting is not love, it's a mechanism of survival. They're not coming back for you. They're coming back for the version of themselves that felt secure, avoiding. They're rehearsing a narrative in which they remain safe, influential, and unthreatened by the emotional truths they avoided confronting while you were available. The irony is painful. The clarity, consistency, and self-contained strength they dismissed while you were present is now the very standard they nostalgically chase in memory. You don't have power because they want you back. You have power because you don't need them to. This is the flip they never anticipated. Your calm is not a strategy. Your silence is not manipulation. Your distance is not revenge. It is regulation. You are grounded in yourself, self-contained, and no longer orbiting their emotional limits. And that is what destabilizes them. Avoidants are accustomed to controlling the narrative through absence, unpredictability, and emotional withdrawal. They measure the world by how much influence they can exert. When your center no longer aligns with their gravity, when your emotional world spins independently of theirs, they feel unsteady. They no longer know how to anticipate your reactions or gauge your value through their usual metrics. The predictability they relied on, the assurance that you would always be emotionally reachable, is gone. And with that loss comes subtle, pervasive unrest. The power you now hold is invisible. It isn't loud or forceful. It doesn't seek validation. It exists in your self-sufficiency, your refusal to chase, your refusal to center your life around their avoidance. And that quiet authority makes them aware for the first time that influence is no longer theirs to wield. They didn't lose you when you left. They lost you when you stopped needing. You became unfamiliar, not cold, not cruel, just self-contained. For an avoidant, that is terrifying. They can avoid feelings, avoid connection, avoid responsibility, but they cannot avoid the realization that someone finally chose themselves without asking permission. You don't demand, you don't plead, you don't orbit. You exist independently, fully and internally resolved. That self-possession, that refusal to require their presence for validation, exposes the gap they never expected. It terrifies them because it cannot be controlled, manipulated, or negotiated. They weren't left, they were left behind by the version of you that stopped waiting, stopped adjusting, and finally became untouchable in the only way that matters, emotionally whole.